Thanks everyone for coming out. The main thing, ironically, you'll notice that nickel is not first in the list, which is talking about Noril'sk. And that's not going to be an accident because, in fact, nickel is only 33% of the value of Noril'sk, and that's probably one of the central themes of today. Noril'sk, the Oktyabrskyi systems we're going to talk about today, are the fourth or fifth largest copper system in the world and easily the highest grade and most valuable ore body in the world, nearly twice the value of Olympic Dam. So that might be why there's a few people in the room, because it isn't just a story about nickel. I'm a person who wears many hats. I put two hats up today. I'm a director of a company that's in the middle of one of these things, and very much involved in Central Asia, as will become very, very clear to everyone as to why I'm so enamored with the place. Rocky calls me a little bit of a Russianophile. I've spent a lot of time working in ex-Soviet lands, and I'm very, very fond of learning from the Soviets. In 1984, they had 184,000 exploration geologists. And as a result, you've got to be pretty humble to realize just how impressive they were as explorers. Of course, things have gone downhill since then. There's no way we would describe Russia in the same light as the Soviet Union. But one of the things that I like is this stamp on the left. So exploration geologists were held in such high regard, along with cosmonauts, that the cosmonauts described them as the brothers of the wind and sun. I think that's a really nice term. I've had a lot of sun damage from the state, so it's a good way to describe myself. So the word nickel begins here in the Pankali belt, or the bitless belt as it's sometimes known. The real significance of this part of the world is this is pre the end of the Bronze Age. Copper, tin, and iron are ancient metals, but nickel doesn't get identified until 1751 AD, and you can see we're well and truly in the BCs. So get this to work. The other place in the world that's operating in nickel at the time is Abu Swahail in Nubia, in the upper lands of Egypt. And we see nickel in artifacts from the first dynasty onwards in pharaonic tombs. It's quite an extraordinary concept because at that stage, we have, this nearly works, Egypt, the Levant, and Turkey, for want of a better word, or the Hittite Empire. Now, all these lands, including the Egyptians, fail in 1177 when the world is overrun. The city I just mentioned in this song is only preserved because the Sea Peoples, which really is their name, destroyed most of the Mediterranean, along with mass migration and the like. Now, the word on nickel jumps. It's really important that it's going to jump. But the next time we see the nickel in the archaeological record, it's here. It's not going to work. It's just too slow. In Greco-Bactria. Now, Bactria is a long way from Greece. And this is really important. 180 BC, jumping from pre-Bronze Age. All of a sudden, in the aftermath of Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia, right on the eastern edge, well away from the Greek and the Mediterranean, we find Bactria, which is in modern-day Afghanistan. Okay, Bactria is a Hellenistic kingdom at the time and the edge of the empire. It's right on the edge with China, but China at this stage was restricted inside the Chinese borders. Likewise is India. The importance of this is important because as a result of this, you can guess there's got to be a theme of nickel in this story. Nickel marks the moment when the Yuezhi, which are the nomadic people from the north, are pushed out by the Han in China and invade the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms. And as a result of being invaded, they have to mint new coins in a hurry, and they choose nickel sulfides. They choose nickel, copper, PGE sulfides as a form of currency. Coins were invented in Eastern Anatolia, Western Anatolia actually, not long beforehand. But in fact, for the first time in history, coins are made in nickel. Now, of course, if any of you are old enough to remember why copper nickel was used in coins in the first place, it's as a replacement of silver. And it's the same logic for the Bactrians. Short on silver supply, long on copper, short on gold. They start minting nickel copper sulfides. This coin that I've got in front of you, which I am going to circulate around, is absolutely gorgeous. It's not priceless, but it's worth more than you guys. On one side is a snow leopard, which is a key to the origin of the system. And on the other side is a Greek god, the god of wine. And written on the front in Greek, it says King Agathocles, who's one of the Greco-Bactrian kings who lived here in this portion. The reason that orange is big and obscuring everything is I'm trying to hide exactly where it is. What happens immediately after this is the Qin and Han dynasty send an envoy across the mountains to Bactria to find out who lives outside of China for the first time. It's the first time the Chinese have engaged with the rest of the world. And they find the Bactrians 10 years too late, literally 10 years too late, and they've been destroyed. Bactria has been destroyed. The remnants of Al-Qanum sit right now on the Tajikistan border. It's a phenomenal place. As a result of China interacting with this part of the world, a young man called Zhang Qian goes on a remarkable expedition. It's an expedition that takes him all the way around interacting with India. At the same moment in time, just to put history in context, the Roman Empire is born, and Octavian takes on Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra is a Greek, and she wants to escape to Greco-Bactria. The Greco-Bactria is dying. The Greek Empire is dying. The remnants of it are dying on this portion, on the side of the world as well. And with it dies nickel from the rock record again. So nickel dies. One of the reasons why nickel keeps coming and going is there are literally no nickel sulfides really in Europe during the time of the Greeks and the Romans. Marco's looking at me going, what about Northern Italy? And there are no nickel sulfides in the Near East as well. And so we see this punctuated innovation style. But the Chinese really pick up. And in southern China, during the Southern Dynasty, they mine the Aimshan Lip and Huli, and nickel gets off and running for the first time massively within Chinese walls. But would you believe outside of China, nickel undergoes another stagnation, and we don't see it until the rise of the Russian Empire, when the Russians arrive at Mangazaya in the north and find a small occurrence called Bear Mountain. Bear Mountain becomes Bear's Brook, which is translated as Noril'sk, the world's biggest deposit. And here's the scary thing. Jinchuan, the second largest, and Noril'sk are both rediscoveries of 100 to 1,000-year-old deposits. They were found a long time ago and rediscovered. Let's, I think I've got a slide in here. This slide here, Rocky will recognize this. This is Jinchuan. This is the Hexa corridor in the province of Gansu. This is the main exit point for the Chinese out of China into the rest of the world by foot. The significance of the coin on the left is it says Ningguanbao. Before Jinchuan was discovered in 1959, Mao Zedong was looking for a source of uranium. For those of you who know the Campbell story, looking for green rocks. And these guys arrived in this malachite occurrence, this fallen mine called Ningguanbao, which had already been mined for coins many millennia earlier. And they rediscovered Jinchuan in 1959. And let's go to a modern example. This is 1994, and this is the Discovery Hill at Voisey's Bay. This is a known copper showing that diamond explorers come and relook at and find contains nickel. So I've got a real simple message in here, and it's best captured by this phrase here. Where's the best place to hide a leaf? And the answer is in a forest. Where's the best place to hide a nickel copper system? Amongst copper. We've been doing it throughout the entirety of Earth history, and we still continue today to misidentify nickel copper systems as copper. I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about how that's possible. But you will have seen, those of you who work in the nickel copper space, one of the ways we commonly think about nickel sulfides is to put them on a nickel PG copper diagram. It's actually disguising an awful lot of sins. And one of them is that within this diagram includes most nickel sulfide systems contain nickel, PGs, and copper, but in vastly different volumes and tenors. So if I start an example, most of the world's nickel sulfides that we see here in WA sit in this corner. They have a bit of copper and they have a bit of PGs. You could say some of them have metal credits, but we're not going to talk about deposits with metal credits because we're in a nickel low. We're going to talk about systems that are truly economic. PG deposits are dominated by low-grade systems. There are no high-grade PG deposits. Even the flat reefs are low-grade. We also get magmatic copper deposits. So it's not something that's commonly realized, but just as sulfur often drives nickel sulfides to saturation, oxides drive more evolved systems to sulfur saturation and form magmatic copper deposits. The world's biggest example is China, 7 million copper tons. Volkovsky and O'Keefe are both in production, and some of you will know the Curacao or Kariba belt. And of course, there's our iron supplement in the Musgraves, which is currently not economic, and at the current moment, it is a large magmatic copper system. But I want to draw your attention to the middle of this graph, where I've written the word polymetallic deposits. The significance of that is clearly it's in the same continuum. So why am I making a point? It's going to become clear. Right in the middle is the word N and the word Octobrisky. Octobrisky is the world's biggest deposit. In situ value, $1.4 trillion. Enormous. I'll show you the footprint of this in a minute. And two other systems that I want to draw your attention to, notably Sakatti, which is in Finland, a similar deposit style. Let's put them on a graph. Make sure you understand that's copper equivalent and not copper, although it wouldn't matter. And you can see Octobrisky sitting out there. Here's a few of your favorite porphyries and Olympic Dam. And you can see that Octobrisky stands out even amongst the supergiants as an anomalous system. Now note that it says Octobrisky. I've taken Talnak and Noril'sk off this map. So what are polymetallic deposits? What's the definition? This is my definition. Equal metal value for 4+ metals, nickel, copper, and PGs. Yes, it's a nickel system. Economic gold and silver. Noril'sk is a 12 million ounce gold system. That's not insignificant, given it's the 8th ranking metal for the deposit. It's quite incredible when you find these, what I call periodic table deposits. I have a competition with Kathy Ehrig, who loves to put up how many elements the Olympic Dam has. It's a straight competition here with the Octobrisky system. But we're talking about high grade, not low grade systems. Nothing like the copper systems of porphyries, sediment-hosted copper, or even IOCGs. We're talking about very small intrusions, not large layered intrusions. We're talking about high-grade copper. We're talking about multiple % copper-bearing systems and considerably higher PG grades than we see in the layered intrusions. We're talking about nickel systems that have hydrothermal footprints. Any of you know anything about nickel, that should be a very peculiar comment because they started life as dry tholeiitic melts, but they generate through interaction with juicy carbonates, evaporates, and phosphates, hydrothermal systems. Their dominant characteristic is they have what we call unidirectional metal zonation. As the word implies, they're zoned simply from nickel to copper or from other metals, but unidirectional, as in there's a large-scale zonation that generates a copper portion of the ore body that is further concentrated in terms of metals. And here's the last point. We walk over them, we decline them. One of the reasons, if you get to the upper parts of these systems, they're extremely unprospective looking. So some of these mafic rocks have less than 2% MgO. Here's where I have my usual plug. Noril'sk contains no ultramafic rocks. It's a myth that I hear all the time. It's in lower MgO rocks. There are no ultramafic rocks at Noril'sk. And the top of Noril'sk is only 2% MgO. When my boss in my BHP days saw the top of Octobrisky, his comment was, "This is Hungary. I wouldn't bother with this." It's the world's largest deposit. There's a message in there. That's not a comment about my boss. The thing that's most commonly mistaken is Bechy VMS, and by far the most common mistake is calling them iron oxide copper gold systems. You might be thinking, geez, an iron oxide copper gold looks a lot different to a nickel sulfide. Well, keep that comment for another half an hour and we'll see whether you think the same thing. But obviously, these systems are a lot bigger tonnage and higher grade than IOCGs. So that's the thing to be careful of. Here's my Kathy Eric moment to show the periodic table. And this is why it's worth pulling these out in a special subcategory, because we're not talking about nickel, copper. We're talking about a host of other elements, a host of things that you might even mistake for other deposit stuff. Quite commonly, the tops of these systems are anomalous in zinc and copper, silver and gold, elements that you wouldn't necessarily think to think of when it comes to nickel sulfide systems. And that's going to be my point. So just to show that metal zonation, all nickel sulfide systems show local scale sulfide fractionation, all of them. And they all have things like chalcopyrite stringers. We have them in Kambalda, for example. It's an insignificant detail on a local scale. But in concentrically zoned systems that have got large amounts of massive sulfide, we see significant sulfide fractionation. And we see the development of large scale copper sulfides. But in these unidirectional systems, we see large scale separation of copper from nickel, and therefore further enrichment. This is what creates the money. Unidirectional can be both upwards and down. At Sudbury, the zonation is downwards into copper, but at Oktyabrsky, it's upwards. At Sakatti, it's upwards. It's going to be important, but just so everybody understands, we're not talking about downward systems like Sudbury. So all deposits look a little bit like this. This is from Nova. It's a really insignificant detail. But the bottom of these big systems look like that, and the tops look like that. Tornado image on the left, and specimen photos on the right. Mineralogy is fundamentally different. Nickel copper nickel copper on the bottom, copper, gold, and silver on the top. And this is why we want to highlight it. This is the selective ores. Why highlight a subtype? Why mention the concept of a subtype? Why not just deal with nickel? Because these deposits don't care what the nickel price is. This is the Oktyabrsky selective ores. It's nearly pure chalcopyrite cubonite, plus or minus bornite, 3% nickel and 160 grams. That's what you call a money-making rock. So what Oktyabrsky looks like, this is from Peter Lightfoot from Igor Zotov's work. This is in plan view here. The red one here, this long one is a long channel from tarmac. I want to highlight these two yellow spots in here, which are in what we call the Karalak intrusion. And the Karalak intrusion has two major ore bodies, Oktyabrsky and Komsomolsky. And these are what we call terminuses. These are intrusions that just end. Here it is in cross-section. The green is the intrusion, the red is the massive nickel sulfide, and the yellow at the top of the intrusion, very significantly, is the copper dominant sulfide. This zone here is at the top, and it's not going to be ambiguous as to why. These systems are inside and mixed as a skarn system, a copper skarn. They are sulfide fractionates, but they are now well and truly hybridized with evaporite skarns. I want you to remember that, because they're going to come back and say there is such a thing as evaporites and evaporites. And it actually really matters that this system is in gypsum as opposed to the rest of the system is in anhydrite. This is what Oktyabrsky looks like in plan view. And the real point of this slide is just to show the scale. Because when we're digging big holes out of the ground and we're talking about how big Olympic Dam is, and we talk about how big Chiquiquimada is or Escondida, this is your world's biggest deposit. And it's a hell of a lot smaller than most people think. And therefore, it's a hell of a lot easier to hide. And that's going to be relevant to a complex search space when we get into it. So very small systems hosted in very small intrusion. The Oktyabrsky intrusion is 120 meters. That is all it is. It's a completely different task chasing a high-grade system, even these big systems. So what Oktyabrsky looks like at the top, intercalated with shale, is this unit in here. This is an anhydrite chalcopyrite cubonite skarn system. Showing you in cross-section, nickel sulfides at the bottom of this system. What I want to draw your attention to is the sulfide hatch at the top. This is the copper sulfides. This is the nickel copper sulfides, nickel dominant at the bottom. What's significant, if you look at the green here, is just how fluidal everything. This is an enormous fluidal pepperite. It's a pepperite. A pepperite is a mixed rock between magma and usually sediment. It's not sediment. This is a Permian Permo-Triassic intrusion placed into Devonian rock. This is absolutely unique. This is the only place in that I know of in the geological rock record where a magma can interact with an old rock and the rock will behave like an unconsolidated fluid. It's very important because this is anhydrite at the bottom and this is gypsum and halite at the top. It's now converted to anhydrite. Gypsum is converted to anhydrite. There's a 33% volume change with that, 33% loss of volume. That's why there's so much copper sulfide sitting in this system. Just that massive change in volume associated with the thermal emplacement. It's what it looks like. So Noril'sk and Oktyabrsky, Noril'sk is another little intrusion within the camp. They both assimilated sulfates. Everybody talks about sulfate assimilation. It's pretty unambiguous. But Oktyabrsky sits in hydrosulfates. So this is the question that I started. Oktyabrsky is 60 times the size of Noril'sk. It's therefore not an academic detail to separate them out and ask, why is Oktyabrsky so big? Here's another question I want to leave you with. Was Noril'sk even economic? I don't think so. I don't think Noril'sk was ever an economic deposit. It was only mined from Gulag labor. If we never had Gulag labor at Noril'sk, no one would have ever found Talnach or Oktyabrsky. Why is that significant? Well, it would still be covered unfound today in the world. A lot of people tell me that what I'm trying to do is impossible. Those are the words they use. And I'm like, I'm not even sure it was possible for the people who did it. So something to remember is a little bit of the serendipity of life. So these little intrusions, we call them chonoliths. It's a term the Soviets use. This is in green in here with sulfides at the bottom. The real significant thing about all of these intrusions when they're placed into evaporites is the hydrothermal system they generate. This hydrothermal system is exaggerated in what we call the roga or the horns of the intrusion. These are apices. Another way to think of it, the take home might be the exhaust, the thing coming off the intrusion. We get exogenic mineralization. That's going to be important. We get very unique thermal conditions. Merwenite facies, if you've never heard of it before, it's a relatively unique thermal contact metamorphic facies with the diagnostic merwenite. I don't know if you guys know how to identify merwenite. I certainly don't. As well as associated with this, there's a large amount of alkaline material. And so logically, we generate a huge scale albertization, including red rock alteration. There's that word that I'm going to mention a few times again, red rock alteration. Certainly think you're looking at an IOCG, but you're not. Exogenic skarns are the most common thing that we see. A lot of people tell me you don't get skarns associated with mafic rocks. In fact, someone on LinkedIn probably tells me every day that there's no such thing. I can assure you that there is. These systems don't care with the mafic or felsic intrusion. The skarns themselves are no different to felsic, associated with felsic magmas, just a lot rarer because the magmas themselves are volatile poor. So there's nothing unique about the skarns themselves. And here's the big thing that we're all recognizing in the nickel world now. Endogenic skarns are so common in nickel sulfide deposits. When we think of a chonolith, this is the way I try and explain a chonolith. Think of it as a snake. Imagine a snake slithering across the ground. One of the key ways you can generate value as a snake is the concept of bicephaly, some sort of bifurcation, trifurcation. Every time Noril'sk bifurcates, it dumps out sulfides. Quite commonly, Karalak is tri, and that's really important for how we take huge ore bodies and split them into smaller and smaller. Nickel sulfides is all about putting as much mass through a small space as possible. It's just a different way to think of it. The way I try and remember this is, and when I'm trying to explain it to people, it's a bit like if you're a kimberlite diamond explorer. It would be nice if kimberlite formed in kilometre-wide pipes, but if they did, diamond grade would be low. In order to create grade, diamond pipes have to be confined. In order to create grade in nickel sulfides, intrusions have to be confined. You might want them to be bigger. In fact, you might find them to be bigger. That's called a Malmquist bias. That's a bias where you go, hey, at the government scale pre-competitive data, 400-meter line space, I can see intrusions. I don't need to look for little intrusions. Well, guess what? you can't see the target you're looking for. That's the whole point of realizing that. You cannot see your target intrusions in government scale data. You are fooled into thinking this because you can see other intrusions. You are chasing the 1 kilometre wide diamond pipes that don't exist. Next thing to talk about is geophysically, they're genuinely different. I don't know if there are any geophysicists in the room, but they've got a very different EM response. EM is the workhorse of the nickel sulfide industry. These are significantly lower conductance. Everyone goes, oh, that's still good enough conductance to find with EM. Correct, but not in the middle of a nickel-only project. You certainly walk over these. No one's going to drill this lower conductance plate deliberately. So they're actually left behind. We deliberately don't target them in EM studies. In fact, the majority of these deposits are found using IP. Those of you who are geophysically inclined will know that IP in and around ultramafic rocks is a bit of a disaster as well. Hence why they are electrically quite complex. We can use alteration systems to work them. I already showed the scan systems that were developed here. This is the Noril'sk intrusion again. This is Komsomolsky, and this is Oktyabrsky. Very much alteration systems, as I mentioned, very much not so much like iron oxide copper gold systems, but more like iron oxide apatite systems. And here's the key. Every belt that he's in has iron oxide apatite deposits in them already. That's one of the key targeting ingredients we use. So it's not a surprise. In fact, the way I like to describe it is an iron oxide apatite system is the same ingredient list, but a different recipe. It's got the same things that we want, but they're ordered in a different way. So it isn't a surprise that we'll find them together. Alteration systems, we can use these as paleo-erosion level indicators. I know where I am in a sill system in these mirrolitic cavities and from the propylitic alteration that we see. This is endogenous propylitic alteration. You can tell whether I'm within 10 meters or 20 meters of the top. That's going to be relevant because the intrusion was only 120 meters thick. It might be 200 or 300 meters at maximum, but they're small. I need to know where I am. I need to know where the tip is, and I need to know where the base. Here's a kicker. We're really good at identifying the base of nickel sulfide intrusion. We're very poor at identifying the top. The top is very, very much looking unprospective. And as a result, that's a pretty narrow erosional window to be aiming for. It's a very narrow window. I get to work a lot in salt these days. I get to travel the world. It's wonderful. I get to fly over Iran 2 or 3 times a year. Here I am here. These are salt glaciers, Namakwias. It's a wonderful sight to see helikinesis in active, working right in front of your face. You can sit and stare out the plane window and just watch the salt. It's a little bit more challenging to work in older salt systems, but the largest footprint of these systems is caused by the removal of salt because evaporites don't preserve, okay? Evaporites don't so much as not preserve well as they vanish in the rock record. So we have to work by their absence. It's quite a challenging concept. If you haven't heard me talk philosophically about absence and exploration, it's really important to be able to find things based on indirect evidence. We go and have a look at the Kevitsa-Sakatti halo system here, which are 2 nickel sulfide systems in Finland. Sakatti itself is very clearly really complex. It's so helikinetically disturbed, it's not funny. And one of the things we have to do in that environment is image what we call a mother salt. That's the relic salt that might be left over. So this is a 2 billion-year-old system that turns out has well-preserved bedded and evaporites. Rather than tell you, I'm going to show you. This is from Sakatti, and that is a 2 billion-year-old evaporite. And it's still very much preserved. And in fact, in neighboring Russia, even halite and gypsum is still preserved. Gypsum is a real challenge. We see these breccia pipes associated with them. And we are increasingly now moving towards different seismic techniques because anhydrite is a seismic gold star. High density, great acoustic impedance. It's an absolute beauty. In fact, so much that it's hard to see underneath anhydrite. So let's put some of this into practice with the last part of our talks, where we talk about now what this means if we wanted to look for this. This is the discovery of Oktyabrsky in 1965. This is what Bruce Hobbs calls a typical blind node science book. Look, 2 examples. If we had central oil in Mongolia, how do we find and see evidence of Hugo Gamma? In this example, how do we find Oktyabrsky from a few hundred meters away at Tallinn? This is a hydrogeochemistry discovery. This is what it looks like. It's just massive, semi-massive chalcopyrite and anhydrite. No nickel numbers reported. That's because the nickel is going to be extremely low, but it'll still be anomalous. But that start of its program is 10 meters of high-grade copper. But associated with these rocks are really unusual mineralogy that it doesn't take rocket science to identify. These are zoned chromium androdites. First time I ever saw chromium androdites, I thought this would be the only time I'll ever see them, but they're large fist-sized things that were used in the discovery of Tarnak and Oktyabrsky. I've now seen them all over the world, and then you realize that you're just not paying attention. It's not something you expected to see in these rocks until you learn that it is to be expected. The second type of Oktyabrsky was found in 2009, also within evaporites, although it took a long time to identify the evaporites. Because here's the kicker about anhydrite. We talk about anhydrite not surviving, or does survive in the rock record. It doesn't survive at the surface. There's very little anhydrite at the surface of the planet. Anhydrite is only preserved at depth. Danny Pierce will tell you, he's in the room, you have to drill quite deep to find bedded, preserved anhydrite. Hundreds to a kilometre, hundreds of meters to a kilometre. But we can just identify the top of this system here based on its chemistry. And so I wrote a little question for you to ask me. How do you know this is from a large deposit? So I can look around the room. There's a few nickel sulfide experts in the room who are probably looking at this going, well, Steve, you're just going to analyse the copper, and then you're going to know the mass balance of what's missing. I'm looking at Charlie. And you get a first order idea of what must be the complement of nickel from even just not one data point, but several data points. This is how you recognise the top of a zone system and recognise the tip of an iceberg. What we see at the tip of the system has these characteristics, and we can then infer what must be submerged. The tip of the iceberg has a number of characteristics that are relatively unique, which we've already talked about. Exogenic and endogenic alteration, exogenic mineralization styles. This process of sulfide fractionation that's unidirectional is generating extreme variations in chemistry. I showed you the periodic table before. This looks nothing like a nickel sulfide anymore. We're not using nickel and copper anymore. We're using a whole range of elements. Here's 12 samples plotted up on a graph in terms of copper and nickel space, but just looking at tenor versus indices of sulfide fractionation. And you can see here, this is what we call ISS cumulates down this end. And at the other end, you can see some pretty extreme sulfide fractionates. Rocks separated like this are extraordinary. The only way to describe this, I gave a talk about last week, and I think I used the word extreme too many times in the talk. Run out of superlative to describe the range of processes that are in operation here. We can see these exact signatures in water. I've known this for 15 years that I've been sitting on this. It's just so frustrating. The same signature is obvious in hydro. Hydrogeochemistry, we've moved increasingly to copper isotopes. You know what's really cool about hydro now is we're moving to drone-based systems. The real key is that we needed to actively filter water in a drone. That's a challenging task. So people who are really kicking at it right now. And that's enabled us to move from a signature which we knew was going to be a bullseye to one that we can actually mass produce. It provides a little bit of a Scott Halley moment. I'm sure you know Scott Halley's work. One of the big aha moments for listening to Scott is when he realized that we could see the zonation and all these other elements just because ICP-MS technology had changed. It's the same in nickel copper sulfate. This is Scott's work in here. Now we can just jump on iogas and leapfrog and easily deal with these systems. And here's the key, the opportunities that were created because the majority of people are not using this toolbox. So you can literally walk up to somebody else's property and quite easily see something that they haven't seen simply because they're assay suite. So evaporites are obviously the holy grail. A lot of people think that I'm talking about sulfur source. I'm sick of sulfur saturation arguments. I'm talking about other things that are going on. So in particular, the source of the volatiles, halogens and alkalis in the system. Second rock, the most common The most easy to identify evaporite in the world is lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli here. It's obviously a gemstone. This is going to be relevant as I pull this all together in terms of archaeology. Lapis lazuli comes from one place in terms of gem quality. This sample here. It comes from the orange spot that I showed you earlier in Greco-Bactrian from Badakistan. This is one of the great lapis lazuli belts of the world. Lapis lazuli now is composed of sodalite and pyrite. The sodalite, lazurite, is a really unusual mineral and very, very unmistakably blue. So unmistakably that in early ancient times, this is the source of the ultramarine color. For many thousands of years, crushed up lapis lazuli was used as the only source of blue. We can track this through history because we can translate hieroglyphics. This is hieroglyphics for lapis lazuli, and that's its description in Coptic. Coptic is the verbal expression of a hieroglyph. Huspad Urat is lapis lazuli. You can track both lapis lazuli and copper. Here it is in cuneiform here. Cuneiform is what we started with when we were talking about the Hittites and with that song. If you ever forget the Ode to Nickel song, that song is written out in cuneiform and hieroglyphs, in this case, Hittite hieroglyphs. We can track these in the rock record. Here we are in Cloncurry district, and here I am in Quebec. Best way to describe rocks like that is, what is this rock? There is no rock type like this. These are the strangest rocks you will ever see. You do not know what you're looking at when you're dealing with metamorphosed evaporites. They're so crazy. Bruce Hobbs here will say there's no such thing as a meta-evaporite. There is, it's just a unbelievably freaky rock. So let's pull that together. I call these halo systems. Why? Unlike just mineral systems models, it become clear that salt is a pivotal ingredient in forming polymetallic system. We needed it in the beginning. The very first thing I do in targeting is find the right basin to be in. Not the right intrusions, not the right large igneous province, not the right gland boundary and lithospheric boundaries and craton margins, but the right basin to go through the entirety of the targeting process. And the last thing that's really important is that it's intrasalt, that it's still hosted both up and both down in salt systems. And that's the feedback loop that's really important. At every stage, I mean, the salt also needed at the beginning. What you're seeing there is a paleoclimate loop. We can use paleoclimatology to target where evaporites should have been in the world, not necessarily where they are. So we can start this whole targeting process without knowing that we can see salt. Why? Because I told you that salt vanishes from the rock record. So we can't use its presence as a targeting ingredient only. We have to use its absence. It's an unusual concept to get used to. On from that. Right, so just by way of concluding, I'll give you a few aha moments. What have I been talking about? Polymetallic systems are supergiant copper deposits. They're significantly bigger than IOCGs, including Olympic Dam. They're very high grade, very, very small systems. The highest grades we'll see for copper and PG. So they've got the same kind of copper grades we might see in Beshi-style VMS. So it's not uncommon to have grades, if you've seen some of my recent releases, in the 20s and 30% over significant distances, high-grade systems. Unique footprints. The word unique is being used appropriately. This is really not just unusual. This is unique to magma interacting with evaporites, magma-salt interaction. Such an unusual process. We often overlook them. We've seen these rejected in reviews. They turn up as copper deposits or copper prospects. They're challenging targets. Erosional level matters so much. It's been a massive learning. A porphyry is a vertical feature that cuts through the crust vertically. It produces a huge hydrothermal system. And erosional level really matters in porphyry systems. But a whole host of nickel sulfide systems, like turning a porphyry on the side and devoiding it of the entirety of the alteration. It's small, it's tiny, it's parallel to the surface, and erosional level, if we drop too far, we're gone. And we have very limited ability to recognize the top. So why are we not finding a lot of these systems? It's simply a lot harder task to recognize when we've got it the near miss and we've got the wrong system. So that's my point. They're considered really rare, but you know what? I do this for a living, and I don't see anybody looking for these systems. I see people looking for nickel sulfide systems, but as we know quite now, they're making tough for themselves because the old adage of fickle nickel couldn't be more appropriate right now. Nickel sulfide systems have always been like this. But polymetallic systems, remember Mark Bennett when node was discovered, and that's just a nickel system with copper as credits. He was asked, you know, what do you think about the nickel price? And he said, Nova doesn't give a shit about the nickel price. High quality systems are still relevant. Oktyabrsky is still the world's premier ore body, regardless of the nickel price today. This is a slide from Johnny Warren showing you a matrix cell mixing and peperitic mixing in salt, in this case carnallite, and amongst halite. I talk about this unique footprint. You cannot mistake the development of fluid or pepperite. It is just a unique process, and it only occurs in salt and unconsolidated sediments. So, by way of finishing up, I'm going to put this coin down here. I encourage you to all look at it. My version of the coin, this coin here, is very tarnished because I've been showing so many people. And it's like, but it's worth looking at. And I am going to talk about the coin to finish up with. But I wanted to give you a couple of tips or aha moments, but they're mine. You'll have your own. And so one of them is that most copper prospects have a limited assay suite. So you don't have the assay suite to be able to identify these deposits. So one of the things I do is just search for leaves in forests. So I mentioned that before. How do you hide a leaf in a forest? How do you hide a nickel copper system amongst copper systems? They're around assaying copper mineral occurrences. It's the lowest of the lowest hanging fruit. It's as easy as it possibly could. So there's a non-rocket science one. But there are other things we can look at. This is aha, what they look like today. The advances in reconstructions over time are stunning. And they led me to another aha moment, which is all the arrows are telling me to go to one place. It's the Paleotethys Ocean here at the beginning of the Permian, just prior to the Permian. I want to draw your attention to the Siberian, which is host Noril'sk, the Tarim, which is hosted in northern China, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and the Imashan, which we mentioned before, which is in China. This system extends all the way west through past Marco's homeland, through northern Italy into eastern Spain, all the way through the Syrian terrains, there are plumes, and all the way through the Punjab chaps and around just off the coast of Western Australia. Homo-Triassic magmatism and large-scale lifts. Here's the key to this basin closes, and everything ends up at one spot in Central Asia. So I spent a lot of time circling these provinces in my career, and I realized that I've been getting it wrong. This is a quote I love. Gunnar Karg is the brother of a guy called Erling Karg. You might know who Erling is. He's the first man to walk to the South Pole of the North Pole by himself. If you're ever interested in reading books from a man who spent a lot of time by himself, I could recommend it. I got lost here before, so now I know where we are. I've seen a lot of nickel sulfide systems in a lot of countries, and now I'm here working in Central Asia. This is Kalatunka and Maksut. These are two examples of the deposit that I showed you with large-scale sulfide fractionation polymetallic systems. But you know what? They're not quite right. That's the 5th and 6th largest nickel sulfide systems in the world. They're both bigger than Nova, but they're still not what we're looking for. So this is where we are in Central Asia. It's a considerably easier place to work than WA. I hope I don't offend anybody there, but it really is an easier place at the moment to work in. There's a few challenges. It's -69 in this photo. Dragging around wires is a challenge doing EM. I already mentioned this. It's got some other issues, obviously, if you get too close to the Russian border. So I want to finish up and open up questions by closing the story about the archaeology. I work in my off time between being an explorer in archaeometallurgy. And the archaeometallurgy that I've been doing is taking this coin, which is that coin there, and analysing lots of these coins, trying to track the provenance of where they come from. So let's take you through a little story. Alexander the Great comes from Macedon, north of what was Greece at the time, but part of the Greek kingdom. He chases Darius, had the famous battle at Gaugamela. That's the big battle, the first of his major battles, or second of his major battles, in fact, with the Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had ever seen. He eventually comes and destroys Babylon, unfortunately Babylon, and then Persepolis, and eventually he ends up all the way over here. Notice the number of Alexandrias there are. This is Bactria, this is Sodia, this is Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, India or modern Pakistan, and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. Pretty challenging part of the world, but this is the crossroads of the world. What do I mean by that? That's not just a throwaway superlative. This literally is the beginning of the Silk Road. So the Silk Road begins, would you believe, as a road called the Lapis Road, based around lapis lazuli. The lapis lazuli forms the beginnings of the trade that eventually connects to Europe. The Roman Empire, when it takes over Greece, connects to India via the Red Sea, via boats. And suddenly the Indus River is opened up as well. And therefore, Rome and India develop relationships and become connected. Everyone connects through this point. This is where Alexander ran into his biggest trouble in trying to defeat the existing Persian Empire. And this is where this coin comes from. And that's what I do. Thank you very much.